The morning of Christmas Day 2025 began with an unusual stillness across London. King Charles III stood alone in his private study at Buckingham Palace, watching the first rays of sunlight pierce through the heavy December clouds. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the handwritten speech that would soon reach millions of people around the world. This would not be an ordinary Christmas message delivered from the comfort of a palace drawing room. Today, he would speak from Westminster Abbey, the sacred place where he had been crowned, where his mother had been crowned, and where centuries of monarchs had sought divine guidance during their darkest hours. The decision to break with tradition had not come easily. For weeks, Charles had wrestled with the weight of what he needed to say to his people. The world had changed dramatically since his coronation, and the challenges facing the Commonwealth were unlike anything previous generations had encountered. Climate disasters had ravaged communities from Australia to Canada. Economic uncertainty gripped families across Britain. Political divisions seemed deeper than ever, and many questioned whether the monarchy still had relevance in an increasingly fragmented society. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the King's private secretary, entered the study quietly. She had worked alongside Charles for over a decade, first when he was Prince of Wales, and had witnessed his transformation from heir to sovereign. The burden of kingship had aged him visibly, carving deeper lines around his eyes and silvering what remained of his hair. Yet there was something different about him this morning, a sense of purpose that she had not seen since the early days following his mother's death. "Your Majesty, the security team reports that Westminster Abbey is ready for your arrival," Sarah said softly. The BBC technical crew completed their final checks an hour ago. They estimate the global audience will exceed 2 billion viewers. Charles nodded, still gazing out at the London skyline. Somewhere out there, families were gathering for Christmas dinner, children were unwrapping presents, and people were seeking comfort in tradition during uncertain times. He thought of his own family, scattered across different royal residences for the holiday. William and Catherine were at Sandringham with their children, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the constant scrutiny. Harry remained in California, their relationship still strained by years of public disagreements and private pain. "Sarah, do you remember the conversation we had last Christmas?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You asked me what I hoped to accomplish in my reign." "I do, Your Majesty." "You said you wanted to be a bridge between the past and the future." "Yes, but I think I was being too abstract then. Too focused on grand ideas rather than real people." He turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that surprised Sarah. "Today is about something more fundamental. It's about honesty." The journey from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey took place in unusual silence. Instead of the traditional state Bentley, Charles had chosen to travel in a simple black car with minimal escort. He wanted this day to feel different, less ceremonial and more personal. As they drove through the streets of London, he observed the city awakening to Christmas morning. Early dog walkers bundled against the cold, shop owners checking their storefronts, and the occasional homeless person seeking shelter from the December chill. The sight of people struggling even on Christmas Day reinforced his resolve. This speech would not be filled with platitudes about duty and tradition. It would acknowledge the real fears and hopes of ordinary people, and it would reveal something of his own journey as a man thrust into an ancient role during revolutionary times. Westminster Abbey stood majestically against the grey London sky, its Gothic towers reaching toward heaven like stone prayers. Charles had insisted that the usual crowds be kept away, requesting instead that the area around the Abbey remain open to anyone who wished to gather. As his car approached, he could see small groups of people beginning to assemble outside the ancient walls, some holding candles despite the daylight, others simply standing in quiet contemplation. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere was unlike anything Charles had experienced there before. The vast space, which had hosted his coronation with thousands of guests and elaborate pageantry, now felt intimate and sacred in its simplicity. A single camera was positioned near the altar, with minimal lighting equipment carefully placed to preserve the Abbey's natural atmosphere. The only witnesses would be a handful of technical staff and Dean of Westminster, who had agreed to this unprecedented arrangement. Archbishop Williams, who would normally conduct such ceremonial events, had been asked to remain at Canterbury. This was not about religious hierarchy or state protocol. This was about one man, who happened to be king, speaking directly to his people about the challenges they all faced together. As Charles walked slowly down the nave, his footsteps echoing in the silence, he passed the tombs of monarchs who had ruled during their own times of crisis. Elizabeth I, who had faced the Spanish Armada. Charles I, who had lost his head during Civil War. George VI, who had led the nation through World War II. Each had faced moments when the future of their realm hung in the balance, when personal courage mattered more than royal protocol. He reached the coronation chair, where he had sat just 2 years earlier to receive the St. Edward's crown. Today, he would sit in a simple wooden chair placed facing the camera, dressed not in ceremonial robes but in a dark suit that any grandfather might wear to Christmas dinner. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. The Dean approached quietly. "Your Majesty, we are ready when you are." Charles looked around the abbey one final time, drawing strength from its 800 years of history. Kings and queens, poets and warriors, scientists and saints all rested within these walls. They had all faced their own moments of testing, their own choices between the easy path and the right one. Dean Morrison, before we begin, I want you to know that what I am about to say may not be what people expect from their king on Christmas Day. The Dean, a thoughtful man in his 60s who had served the Abbey for over 2 decades, smiled gently. "Your Majesty, this sacred space has heard truth spoken to power for centuries. I suspect it can handle whatever truth you feel called to share today." Charles took his seat, adjusted the microphone that had been discreetly placed, and looked directly into the camera lens. Somewhere beyond that glass eye were millions of people seeking leadership, comfort, and hope during difficult times. Many of them were questioning whether institutions like the monarchy still mattered in their daily lives. Some were struggling to put food on their tables or heat their homes. Others were caring for aging parents or worried about their children's futures. The red recording light appeared, indicating they were live to the world. Charles took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of history and the burden of truth settling on his shoulders. This would be the most important speech of his life, delivered from the most sacred space in his realm, on the most significant day of the Christian calendar. "My beloved people," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I speak to you today not from the comfort of a palace, but from this ancient abbey where your prayers and mine have echoed through the centuries. I am here because the times we live in demand something more than tradition. They demand truth." Outside the abbey, the gathering crowd fell silent as his words reached them through portable radios and mobile phones. Around the world, families paused their Christmas preparations to listen. This was clearly going to be different from any royal Christmas message they had ever heard. Charles continued, his gaze never wavering from the camera. "For too long, those of us in positions of privilege and power have spoken about your struggles from a distance, offering sympathy when what you need is action, providing comfort when what you deserve is change. Today, I want to speak to you not as your king looking down from an ivory tower, but as a fellow human being who has learned that true leadership sometimes means admitting when the system itself needs to change." The words hung in the air of the abbey like incense, carrying with them the promise of revelations to come. Sarah Mitchell, watching from the palace through a secure feed, felt her breath catch. This was indeed going to be unlike any speech a British monarch had ever delivered. In living rooms across Britain and throughout the Commonwealth, people leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that they were about to witness history being made. Children stopped opening presents, adults paused their cooking preparations, and elderly viewers adjusted their hearing aids to ensure they would not miss a single word. Charles had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. The traditional Christmas message of dutiful service and gentle encouragement was being replaced by something far more dangerous and potentially transformative. He was about to tell his people not just what they wanted to hear, but what they needed to hear, regardless of the personal cost to himself or the institution he represented. The first part of his extraordinary Christmas address had begun, and already it was clear that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The king had chosen truth over comfort, authenticity over tradition, and the consequences of that choice would ripple through his realm and around the world for years to come. The silence that followed Charles's opening words stretched across Westminster Abbey like a hell breath. In television studios around the world, news anchors struggled to process what they were hearing. This was not the carefully scripted, politically neutral Christmas message that royal protocol had perfected over decades. This was something entirely unprecedented in the modern history of the British monarchy. Charles shifted slightly in his chair, his hands clasped together, wedding ring catching the soft light filtering through the Abbey's ancient stained glass windows. Behind him, the tombs of past monarchs seemed to lean in, as if their spirits were listening to this descendant who dared to speak truths that had been whispered in palace corridors but never declared publicly. "I know many of you are struggling," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know that families are choosing between heating their homes and buying Christmas dinner. I know that young people are wondering if they will ever be able to afford homes of their own. I know that parents lie awake at night worrying about climate change and what kind of world they are leaving for their children." In a modest terraced house in Manchester, Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old retired nurse, sat transfixed in front of her small television. She had been rationing her heating all winter, wearing multiple layers indoors to keep warm. Her meager pension barely covered her basic needs, and she had given up her traditional Christmas feast this year, settling instead for a simple meal of soup and bread. Tears began to stream down her weathered cheeks as she realized that the king, of all people, was acknowledging her reality. "He knows," she whispered to her small tabby cat, the only witness to her daily struggles. "He actually knows." Across the Atlantic, in Toronto, David and Maria Santos gathered with their 3 teenage children around their tablet, the only device they owned capable of streaming the broadcast. David had lost his job as a construction supervisor 6 months earlier, and Maria's work at a local grocery store barely kept them afloat. They had told their children there would be no gifts this Christmas, using the money instead to keep their small apartment. As Charles spoke, their eldest daughter, Isabella, reached for her mother's hand. "Mom, is the king talking about us?" Isabella asked, her voice filled with wonder and confusion. Maria nodded, unable to speak as she watched this powerful man acknowledge the existence of families like hers, families who had felt invisible to those in positions of authority for far too long. Back in Westminster Abbey, Charles paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing with the most difficult part of his message. "I stand before you today in a building that represents 8 centuries of British tradition, wearing the invisible crown of an institution that has survived by adapting to changing times. But I must tell you truthfully that some of our traditions have become barriers to progress rather than bridges to a better future." The camera captured every nuance of his expression as he spoke, the slight tremor in his voice, the way his eyes seemed to look beyond the lens directly into the souls of his listeners. This was not performance, this was confession. "The wealth inequality in our society has reached levels that would have shocked my predecessors. The climate crisis threatens the very foundations of civilized life. Mental health challenges affect millions of our people, yet we continue to treat them as private struggles rather than public responsibilities. And, too often, those of us in positions of privilege have offered thoughts and prayers when what was needed was policy and action." In the newsroom of BBC headquarters, Editor-in-Chief Patricia Holbrook watched the live feed with growing amazement and concern. In her 30 years of journalism, she had never witnessed a serving monarch speak with such directness about controversial political issues. Her phone was already buzzing with calls from government officials, opposition leaders, and constitutional experts, all seeking comment on what many were already calling either the most courageous or most dangerous royal speech in modern history. "Get me a direct line to Downing Street," she told her assistant. "And contact our constitutional correspondent. We're going to need expert analysis on this immediately after the broadcast ends." The implications were staggering. For generations, British monarchs had maintained careful political neutrality, offering general encouragement and traditional values while studiously avoiding specific policy positions. Charles was obliterating that careful balance with each passing minute. Meanwhile, in the Abbey, Charles reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded letter. The paper looked ordinary, even worn, a stark contrast to the ornate surroundings and the gravity of the moment. "3 weeks ago, I received a letter from a young mother in Wales," he said, unfolding the document carefully. "She wrote to tell me about her son, aged 8, who asked her why the king lives in a palace while their family lives in a single room above a chip shop. She wanted to know what she should tell him about fairness and justice in a world that seems to offer so little of either." The camera captured his hands trembling slightly as he held the letter. This was not theatrical emotion, this was genuine human response to genuine human pain. I could give you the traditional answer about duty and service, about how those who are given much are expected to give much in return. But that child deserves better than platitudes. He deserves action. And so do all of you. In that single room above a chip shop in Cardiff, 8-year-old Liam Jenkins sat beside his mother, Emma, both of them staring at the screen in complete shock. Emma had written that letter in a moment of frustration and despair, never imagining it would reach the king personally, much less be read aloud to the entire world. "Mum, is that your letter?" Liam asked, his young voice filled with awe. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, love. That's my letter." For the first time in months, she felt hope stirring in her chest. Not because she expected immediate change, but because someone in power had truly heard her voice and chosen to amplify it rather than ignore it. Charles carefully refolded the letter and returned it to his pocket, the gesture somehow more powerful than any crown or scepter he had ever held. "Today, I am announcing the establishment of the Commonwealth Emergency Housing Initiative, funded initially by the sale of several properties from the Crown Estate. Within 6 months, we will provide immediate temporary accommodation for 10,000 families currently experiencing homelessness across our realms." The announcement hit the newsroom like an earthquake. Constitutional experts would later debate whether the monarch had the authority to make such unilateral decisions about crown properties, but, in that moment, the human impact overshadowed the legal technicalities. Furthermore, Charles continued, "I am calling upon Parliament to implement an immediate emergency heating allowance for all pensioners and low-income families, to ensure that no one in our prosperous nations chooses between warmth and food during the remainder of this winter." Political commentators would spend days analyzing the constitutional implications of a monarch making specific policy recommendations, but, across the Commonwealth, ordinary people heard something different. They heard acknowledgement, validation, and hope. In nursing homes and retirement communities, elderly residents who had lived through World War II and the rebuilding of Britain listened with growing amazement. They had survived rationing, bombing, and decades of social change, but they had never heard their sovereign speak so directly about economic justice and social responsibility. But individual acts of charity, however well-intentioned, cannot solve systemic problems, Charles continued, his voice growing stronger as he approached the heart of his message. "We need fundamental changes to how our society distributes opportunity and resources. We need to acknowledge that the current system, which has served some very well, has failed many others entirely." The words hung in the air like a challenge to every assumption about the role of monarchy in modern democracy. Charles was not just offering assistance, he was critiquing the very foundations of the economic and social order over which he reigned. In university lecture halls where students had gathered to watch what they expected to be a boring traditional ceremony, young people found themselves witnessing what many would later describe as a revolutionary moment. Professor James Harrison, teaching political science at Oxford, watched with his graduate students, all of them recognizing that they were witnessing history being made in real time. "Professor," asked Sarah Chen, one of his doctoral candidates, "is the king allowed to say these things?" Professor Harrison paused, considering not just the constitutional law but the larger implications of what they were hearing. "Legally, it's complicated," he replied. "Morally and politically, it's unprecedented. We're watching the monarchy adapt or possibly transform itself in ways we never imagined possible." Back in the Abbey, Charles prepared to deliver the most challenging part of his address, the section that would either cement his legacy as a transformational leader or mark the beginning of a constitutional crisis that could fundamentally alter the relationship between Crown and Parliament. He looked directly into the camera, no longer speaking to an anonymous audience but to specific individuals whose struggles he had heard, whose letters he had read, whose hopes he now carried forward. "My dear people, what I am about to propose will challenge many assumptions about the proper role of monarchy in our constitutional system. But extraordinary times demand extraordinary responses, and I believe history will judge us not by how well we preserve tradition, but by how courageously we pursued justice." The second part of his extraordinary Christmas address was approaching its climax, and everyone watching sensed that the next words would change everything forever. Charles had already crossed several constitutional red lines, but his expression suggested that the most significant revelations were yet to come. Outside Westminster Abbey, the crowd had grown to several thousand people, all listening in complete silence to their king's unprecedented words. Police barriers had been set up to manage the growing numbers, but the atmosphere remained peaceful, almost reverential. People were witnessing something they had never expected to see, a monarch willing to risk everything for principle. The second part of his historic address had laid the groundwork for transformation, but the promise of more dramatic announcements to come kept the world's attention fixed on this ancient abbey where the future of the British monarchy was being redefined with each passing moment. The weight of anticipation in Westminster Abbey had become almost tangible. Charles sat in silence for nearly a minute, his eyes closed, drawing strength from the sacred space around him and the gravity of what he was about to reveal. When he opened his eyes and looked back into the camera, his expression had transformed. Gone was any trace of royal formality. This was simply a man, who happened to wear a crown, preparing to make the most consequential decision of his reign. "There is something else I must share with you today," Charles began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Something personal that I have kept private for too long because I feared it might undermine confidence in the institution I serve. But I have learned that authentic leadership sometimes requires vulnerability, even when that vulnerability challenges everything we have been taught about strength and authority." Around the world, viewers leaned closer to their screens. The king's tone suggested a revelation that would be deeply personal, and the anticipation was electric. "6 months ago, I was diagnosed with a serious illness," Charles continued, the words dropping like stones into still water. "My doctors have assured me that with proper treatment, my prognosis is good, but the experience of facing mortality has given me clarity about what truly matters and what changes we can no longer delay." In Buckingham Palace, Sarah Mitchell gasped audibly despite knowing this moment would come. They had discussed whether to reveal the king's health challenges, and Charles had insisted that honesty about his condition was essential to the credibility of his message. But hearing him actually say the words to the world still struck her like a physical blow. The diagnosis had been kept secret from all but his closest family and most trusted advisors. William and Catherine had flown back from a holiday early when they learned the news. Harry had called from California, their years of estrangement temporarily forgotten in the face of their father's mortality. Queen Camilla had been his constant support, accompanying him to medical appointments and holding his hand through the sleepless nights when the fear threatened to overwhelm him. "I share this with you not to seek sympathy, but to explain why I can no longer remain silent about the suffering I see around me," Charles continued. "When you face the possibility that your time may be limited, every day becomes precious, and every opportunity to make a positive difference becomes a responsibility you cannot ignore." In living rooms across Britain and the Commonwealth, the response was immediate and emotional. Margaret Thompson in Manchester found herself weeping openly, no longer just for her own struggles but for this man who had chosen to use his pain as motivation for service. The Santos family in Toronto sat in stunned silence, their teenage children beginning to understand that leadership sometimes meant sacrificing personal privacy for the greater good. "My illness has taught me that we are all more fragile than we like to admit, and more connected than we often realize," Charles said. "The virus does not distinguish between palace and council flat, between billionaire and benefits recipient. Climate change affects us all, though its impacts fall most heavily on those with the fewest resources to adapt. Economic uncertainty touches every household, though some experience it as inconvenience while others face it as catastrophe." Dr. Rebecca Martinez, Charles's oncologist at the Royal Marsden Hospital, watched the broadcast from her office, tears streaming down her face. She had treated hundreds of cancer patients over her career, but she had never had one who insisted on using his diagnosis as motivation for social change. During their consultations, Charles had spoken less about his own prognosis than about the patients in the public wards who faced the same disease without access to the same level of care. "Dr. Martinez," he had said during one appointment, "how can I ask my people to trust in the fairness of our system when I receive world-class medical care simply because of an accident of birth while others with the same condition wait months for basic treatment?" It was then that she realized this patient was unlike any she had ever treated. His primary concern was not his own survival but how to use whatever time remained to him to serve others more effectively. Back in the Abbey, Charles reached for a glass of water, buying himself a moment to prepare for the most radical announcement of his reign. What he was about to propose had never been attempted in British constitutional history, and it would either mark him as a visionary leader or trigger a crisis that could end the monarchy altogether. This experience has also taught me that our current systems of government and social support are not working for millions of our people, he said, setting the glass down carefully. For too long, we have accepted inequality as inevitable, poverty as unfortunate but permanent, and environmental destruction as the price of progress. But these are choices, not natural laws, and they are choices we can make differently. In Downing Street, Prime Minister James Fletcher watched the broadcast with growing alarm. His government had been caught completely off guard by the King's unilateral announcements about housing and heating assistance. Constitutional lawyers were already being summoned for emergency consultations about the legal implications of a monarch making specific policy proposals without government consultation. "Sir," his chief of staff interrupted, "we're getting calls from every major news organization requesting immediate comment. The opposition parties are demanding parliamentary sessions to address the constitutional issues raised by His Majesty's speech. And we're receiving reports that spontaneous demonstrations of support are beginning to form in major cities across the country." Fletcher waved him away, his attention fixed entirely on the television screen. He sensed that whatever the King said next would dwarf everything that had come before. Charles straightened in his chair, his decision made, his fear overcome by his sense of purpose. "Therefore, I am today announcing my intention to work with Parliament to establish what I am calling the People's Constitutional Convention," he declared, the words carrying the force of historical transformation. "This body, composed of citizens selected by lottery from across our society, will be tasked with examining how we can create a more just, sustainable, and democratic system of government for the 21st century." The constitutional implications were staggering. No British monarch had ever proposed fundamental changes to the system of government since the English Civil War. Charles was essentially calling for a peaceful revolution, guided by ordinary citizens rather than political elites. "This convention will have the authority to recommend changes to how we select our leaders, how we distribute resources, how we protect our environment, and, yes, what role, if any, the monarchy should play in a truly democratic society," Charles continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke these unprecedented words. In universities across the Commonwealth, political science professors stopped their Christmas celebrations to frantically call colleagues, trying to process what they were witnessing. Professor Elizabeth Hartwell at Cambridge University would later write that Charles's announcement represented the most significant constitutional innovation since the development of parliamentary democracy itself. But, in ordinary homes, the reaction was far simpler and more powerful. People who had felt voiceless in their own democracy were being told that their opinions mattered as much as those of prime ministers and presidents. "Every adult citizen will have an equal chance to be selected for this convention," Charles explained. "Not just those with political connections or university degrees or inherited wealth. Teachers and nurses and factory workers and students and pensioners. People who understand struggle because they live it, people who understand community because they depend on it." Emma Jenkins in Cardiff hugged her son Liam tightly as they listened. For the first time in her adult life, she felt that her voice might actually matter in decisions about her country's future. The convention's recommendations will be put directly to the people through a series of referendums, bypassing the traditional political parties that have too often served their own interests rather than those of the nation, Charles continued. "And I pledge to you today that I will accept whatever verdict the people deliver, even if that verdict is that Britain would be better served by an elected head of state rather than an hereditary monarch." The silence that followed this statement was deafening. No monarch in British history had ever voluntarily offered to abolish their own position based on the will of the people. Charles had just proposed the most democratic process in British history, one that could end with his own abdication and the establishment of a republic. In the press gallery of Westminster Abbey, journalists sat frozen, struggling to process the magnitude of what they had just heard. Royal correspondent Victoria Walsh, who had covered the monarchy for 2 decades, would later describe this moment as the day the British Constitution was reborn. But Charles was not finished. The most personal revelation was yet to come. "My friends, I want you to know that this decision has not been easy," he said, his voice now thick with emotion. "I was raised to believe that duty meant preserving tradition, that service meant maintaining the status quo. But my illness has taught me that true duty sometimes means having the courage to change everything, and authentic service sometimes requires sacrificing everything you thought you valued. He paused, struggling with tears that no king had ever allowed the public to see. I love this institution that I inherited. I love the history and pageantry and continuity it represents. But I love the people I serve more, and if serving them well means ending the monarchy, then that is a sacrifice I am prepared to make. The raw emotion in his voice was unmistakable. This was not political calculation or constitutional theory. This was a man willing to give up everything he had inherited in order to leave his people something better than what he had found. Outside Westminster Abbey, the crowd had grown to tens of thousands, many holding candles despite the daylight, others simply standing in silent witness to this extraordinary moment. Similar gatherings were forming in Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, and cities across the Commonwealth as word spread about the King's unprecedented speech. The third part of his historic address had fundamentally altered the relationship between monarch and people, between tradition and progress, between what was and what could be. But one section remained, and everyone watching sensed that Charles had saved his most powerful words for last. As he prepared for the conclusion of this remarkable Christmas message, Charles seemed to draw strength from every person who was listening, every story of struggle and hope that had brought him to this moment of truth. The boy who would be king had grown into a man willing to sacrifice a kingdom for the sake of justice, and the world was watching in amazement as he prepared to explain why. The silence in Westminster Abbey had become sacred, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath for Charles's final words. He sat quietly for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant as if seeing something beyond the camera, beyond the present moment, into a future that would be shaped by what he said next. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 8 centuries of monarchy and the hope of generations yet to be born. My beloved people, as I prepare to conclude this most unusual Christmas message, I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my grandson, Prince George, just 2 weeks ago, Charles began, a gentle smile softening the gravity of his expression. He asked me why we have kings and queens when other countries have presidents, and whether I thought it was fair that some children are born to be rulers while others are born to be ruled. The mention of the young prince, third in line to the throne, added another layer of poignancy to Charles's words. Here was a grandfather grappling not just with his own mortality and the future of his reign, but with the legacy he would leave for his grandchildren and the moral questions they would inherit. I told him that the only justification for inherited power is if it is used entirely in service of those who have no power at all, Charles continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. I told him that if the monarchy cannot make life better for the least fortunate among us, then it has no reason to exist. And I told him that his generation will inherit the right to decide whether the institution that shaped our family has any place in their future. In Kensington Palace, Prince William stood transfixed before the television screen, his wife Catherine's hand clasped tightly in his own. They had known about their father's health diagnosis, had been consulted about some elements of his plans, but the full scope of what he was proposing still left them breathless. Their eldest son, the boy mentioned in this extraordinary speech, was upstairs playing with Christmas presents, unaware that his grandfather was reshaping his entire future on live television. "William," Catherine whispered, "he's really going to do it. He's going to give them the choice." William nodded, unable to speak. His father had asked him privately weeks earlier whether he would support a process that might end with the abolition of the monarchy, and William had given his consent. But hearing it announced to the world made it real in a way that private conversations never could. "Dad always said that if the monarchy couldn't evolve, it would eventually die," William finally managed. "I just never imagined evolution would look like this." Back in Westminster Abbey, Charles reached into his other jacket pocket and withdrew a different letter, this one written on elegant palace stationery in his own distinctive handwriting. "I have here a letter that I wrote to my people 6 months ago, when I first received my diagnosis," he said, holding the document carefully. "I sealed it then, intending it to be read only after my death. But today, I want to share parts of it with you while I am still here to see your response and to work alongside you for whatever time remains." The intimacy of this gesture was unprecedented in royal history. No monarch had ever shared their private thoughts about mortality and legacy so directly with their subjects. Charles unfolded the letter with trembling hands, and, for the first time in the broadcast, his composure seemed genuinely threatened by emotion. "I wrote, my dear people, if you are reading this, then I have gone to join the long line of my predecessors who served as your sovereign. I pray that my reign, however brief, will be remembered not for the privileges I enjoyed but for the changes I helped to create. I pray that I found the courage to use whatever authority I inherited not to preserve my own position but to secure your freedom to choose your own future. In nursing homes across Britain, elderly residents who had lived through the reigns of 4 different monarchs wept openly. Many had served in wars fought in the name of crown and country, had pledged allegiance to the monarchy through decades of social change. To hear their king voluntarily questioning the very foundation of that system was both heartbreaking and inspiring. At Rosemary Care Home in Yorkshire, 89-year-old James Morrison, a veteran of the Falklands War, wiped tears from his eyes as he spoke to his nurse. "I've served 3 generations of this family," he said quietly. "But I've never respected any of them more than I respect him right now." Charles continued reading from his letter, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly through the Abbey's ancient acoustics. "I wrote, I have spent my entire life preparing to be king, but I learned too late that being king means having the wisdom to know when kingship itself might be the problem. If my death can contribute to the birth of a more just society, then it will not have been in vain." He folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket, then looked directly into the camera with the full force of his conviction. "But I am not dead yet," he said, and, for the first time in the broadcast, a hint of his old humor flickered in his eyes. "And that means I have work still to do. We have work still to do. Together." The shift in his tone was electric. After 45 minutes of unprecedented honesty about illness, inequality, and constitutional revolution, Charles was now speaking about hope, about possibility, about the future they could build together. "The People's Constitutional Convention will begin its work within 6 months," he announced. "But we need not wait for their recommendations to begin changing our society. Today, I am announcing several immediate initiatives that will begin this very week." What followed was the most comprehensive social program ever announced by a British monarch. Charles outlined plans for emergency food distribution centers funded by royal estates, job training programs administered through Crown properties, and mental health support services operating from palace grounds open to the public for the first time in history. "Every royal residence will become a community center one day each week," he declared. "Buckingham Palace will open its doors every Tuesday for job training and educational programs. Windsor Castle will host healthcare clinics every Wednesday. Sandringham will offer agricultural training and environmental education every Thursday. These are your palaces, bought with your taxes, and they should serve your needs." The practical implications were staggering. Tourists might visit Buckingham Palace on Monday to see the changing of the guard, then return on Tuesday to attend a computer literacy class in the same rooms where state banquets were held. In Downing Street, Prime Minister Fletcher sat in stunned silence as his constitutional advisers tried to explain the legal complications of the King's announcements. But, outside his window, he could hear the sound of gathering crowds, and the early reports suggested that public support for Charles's initiatives was overwhelming. "Sir," his chief of staff reported breathlessly, "we're getting preliminary polling data. 78% immediate approval for the King's speech. 85% support for the Constitutional Convention. The opposition is calling for emergency parliamentary sessions, but they're supporting the King's proposals, not opposing them." Fletcher realized that opposing the King's popular initiatives would be political suicide, regardless of the constitutional complexities. Charles had bypassed the traditional political process entirely, appealing directly to the people with such moral authority that resistance was impossible. Meanwhile, in Westminster Abbey, Charles was approaching the conclusion of his historic address. The camera caught every detail of his face, lined with illness and worry but illuminated by something approaching peace. "My dear friends, I began today by promising you truth instead of comfort," he said. "I hope I have kept that promise. The truth is that our current system is failing too many of you. The truth is that those of us born to privilege have not done enough to share it. The truth is that time is running out to address climate change, inequality, and the crisis of democracy itself." He paused, gathering himself for his final words. "But the truth is also that we have within us the power to change everything. You do not need to wait for politicians to give you permission to demand justice. You do not need to wait for institutions to reform themselves. You have the power to choose new institutions, new leaders, new systems that serve your needs rather than perpetuating ancient privileges. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Across the globe, billions of people sat transfixed, sensing that they had witnessed something that would be remembered for centuries. I do not know what you will decide about the future of the monarchy, Charles concluded, his voice thick with emotion but steady with resolve. I do not know whether this institution will survive the necessary changes ahead. But, I know this, whatever future you choose will be more legitimate than the past you inherited, because it will be your choice, made freely, with full knowledge of the alternatives. He stood slowly from his chair, his illness evident in the careful way he moved but his dignity intact. May God bless you all, may you find the courage to choose wisely, and may the future remember this Christmas Day as the beginning of true democracy in our ancient realm. Charles bowed slightly toward the camera, then turned and walked slowly down the nave of Westminster Abbey, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He paused at the tomb of Elizabeth I, offering a brief, private prayer, then continued toward the great doors that would carry him back into a world forever changed by his words. The broadcast ended with a long shot of the empty chair where a king had voluntarily offered to abdicate his power for the sake of his people's freedom. Outside the abbey, the crowd had grown to over 100,000 people, many weeping, many singing hymns, all participating in what historians would later call the most significant day in British constitutional history since the English Civil War. As Charles emerged from the abbey, the crowd erupted not in traditional cries of "God save the King" but in sustained applause that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. He stood on the steps, looking out at the faces of his people, many of whom would soon have the power to vote him out of existence. But, instead of fear, Charles felt only gratitude. He had spoken his truth, offered his sacrifice, and trusted his people with their own destiny. Whatever came next would be their choice, and that knowledge filled him with a peace he had never expected to find. The Christmas Day that had begun with traditional pageantry ended with revolutionary possibility. A king had offered to give up his kingdom, a people had been invited to choose their own government, and democracy had been reborn in the ancient heart of monarchy itself. As the sun set over London on December 25, 2025, King Charles III returned to Buckingham Palace knowing that he might never enter it again as a sovereign. But he also knew that he had done something no monarch before him had ever attempted. He had used absolute power to give his people absolute freedom. The future was now theirs to write, and that was the greatest gift any king could give his people on Christmas Day.